Hello and welcome to Friday Night Live. So this evening we're going to be continuing our series on Can I Ask You a Question? I've got quite a lot that I want to cover this evening, so I'm going to get straight to it. But we're going to continue the conversation with Zoom afterwards as always. So please, any questions you have, just note them down, remember them in your head, and we'll discuss them afterwards. So I just want you to imagine that you're all designers for a moment. And I'm going to ask you a series of things I want you to design in your head. Now, some of these things already exist and have already been made, but I just want you to think about what goes into making these things. So I want you to make a machine that can take solid fuel and convert it into energy. And then I want you to be able to store this energy. Just have a think about the design that would go into that. Now I want you to also think about something that maybe can sense a change in light, whatever that might look like. And now I want you to think about how it might be able to respond to that light, to take in that signal and do something with it. What about something that could detect changes in the composition of the air? Or something even that can detect changes in kind of like solids and liquids as well. Something that responds to sound, but also can take cues from a visual stimulus as well. Now, what about something that knows when it needs recharging, knows if it's too hot or too cold, and something that's capable of even repairing itself when it gets damaged? Now, all of these different machines that you might think about how they are made and how they're designed, obviously a lot goes into that, and you and I can't just think it up on the spot right now, but we can appreciate it. Now, what if you just kind of metaphorically took all these things you've designed and just put them together? Do you think by themselves they would just magically form into some great mega machine? Now, maybe you can imagine that happening. But have you ever stopped to consider that actually all of these things that I've just said, you and I can do? We can take all of those things and we're all pieced together and actually can do all of those functions and more. Now, this is quite a trivial example, and if you haven't guessed already, tonight we're going to be talking about science and religion, or science and Christianity and God. And obviously, evolution and things like that that have maybe alluded to in that analogy are far more complicated, and we'll unpick a little bit of that this evening as well. But that basic principle is that all these building blocks come together over time to form something extraordinary. Now, you might be here for any number of reasons. You might know that we're talking about science and God, and you have specific questions. Now, I may answer those questions, or I might not. And actually, that's why Zoom afterwards is going to be so useful for this session, because you might have those specific questions that we can answer afterwards. You might be here but just because it's Friday Night Live Youth. You didn't know that it was in particular going to be talking about science and God, and that's fine. And hopefully you'll take something useful away from it. But you also might be in that category where your friends talk about it, or you get challenged on the fact that how can you believe in a God when science has clearly disproved it? And we'll also touch on some of those points as well, and hopefully give you some answers to those questions. So hopefully there is something here for everyone, but as I mentioned, we'll discuss more on Zoom afterwards. So let's pray before we start. Lord, thank you that we can come to you just as we are. We don't have to pretend no matter what week we've had. We can just come and sit in your presence. Now, this evening, as we tackle this topic, will you be in the words that I say, and that we'll be open to hear and listen from you. In Jesus' name, amen. And you might have noticed I haven't got Sarah with me this evening, so unfortunately you're going to have to stick with my voice for the entire session. But hopefully it'll be worth it and we can get through this. So there are several things I want to cover this evening. The first is about asking questions, and actually science has a lot to do with that. And this kind of concept of maybe God filling in the gaps of stuff that we don't know. I want to also give a very brief outline of kind of evolution and how that kind of fits in with Christianity as well, because I know that's a common sticking point. And touch a little bit on the fact that is faith irrational, and we're called to have blind faith, and science is rational. And these might just be some of the things that come up when we think about science and God. Now, I'd like to say that I am proud to call myself a scientist. And Sarah's class, when they learnt this, had a very interesting reaction and instantly thought that I, as a scientist, must be responsible for discovering everything. I mean, when you see it in the news, when you read articles and it says scientists have discovered or scientists say this, it's a very broad term. Now, I'm a scientist of a very small section of science. And actually, any scientist is a scientist of a small section of science. Now, with this means that we obviously have an understanding of a lot of general bits of science, but we generally don't have an in-depth understanding. So bear that in mind when you hear things that scientists have said. Normally their understanding is quite narrow, and I'm quite happy to admit that of myself. It's also worth pointing out, before we kind of really get into the nitty-gritty of this, that I don't believe that science and faith are in conflict with each other. Indeed, when you look at Nobel Prize winners, they are both atheists and theists alike, people that believe in God and people that don't believe in God. Something that probably wouldn't happen if science and religion had such a tension between them. Now, I mentioned just very briefly earlier about being a God of the gaps. Do we believe in a God of the gaps? And I think this comes more historically from the fact that things that we didn't understand, we would say, well, that's the mystery of God in that. And as science has kind of evolved and progressed, maybe that's pushed God aside a little bit. Now, I want to make it clear that the majority of Christians don't believe in that type of God. God is not a God in the gaps, and he fills in the areas of knowledge that science can't explain. Actually, God is so much greater than that and is in all of those things and in all of the science. And hopefully through this session, you'll come to understand that a little bit more. Now, a little bit about me and my journey into science. And I was fortunate enough when I was growing up not to really be too concerned with this potential conflict between science and God. What actually was more important to me was when I was on the cusp of going off to university and I completing my A-levels, I knew I really loved science. I really enjoyed studying science. And some of my friends were going to do mission trips and working for the church, going to Bible college and studying theology, wanting to become vicars. And it left me thinking, well, maybe studying science isn't godly enough. Like, maybe as a Christian, I should be doing more Christian things rather than studying science. But I can tell you now, not just then, but throughout the whole thing, I know that God has wanted me to get stuck in and involved in science. He wanted me to go to university and study biochemistry, and he wants me to be where I am right now. And he is most certainly in all of that science that I've studied. There's a song that you may or may not be familiar with by a group called Unspoken, called Reason. And one of the lines of the song says this. It says, "If we could pull back the curtain of heaven, we would see his hand on everything." And I have seen this to be the case. So my first point is about asking questions. So much of scientific discovery is about questioning. And it's through these questions that we grow in our understanding. The Bible is no different. And we see many examples of people asking God questions through prayer, or asking Jesus questions about his parables or how to live their lives. In Acts 17:11 we read, "Now the Jews were of much more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true." Now, obviously, this was Paul talking about the life of Jesus and what the gospel had to say. And we see here that they received it with great eagerness and examined the scriptures to see if what Paul said was true. It doesn't say that they merely accepted it and they knew that that must be true. They examined it. And this is what we do as scientists. If you came into my office when a new paper had been published on some area of science, whether it's of keen interest to us or not, and obviously at the moment with stuff coming out about vaccines and our understanding of COVID, and that's kind of like the hot scientific news at the moment. you would see all of us kind of go, oh, well, who did it? Okay, do we know if they're trustworthy or not? Okay, how did they do it? What did they look at? What things did they include in their study? What things didn't they include? We examine it, and that's how we come to trust in whether what they say we believe to be correct or not correct. And actually, in science, normally every little study is just a small piece of the jigsaw in our understanding. It can't by itself explain something. Now, many people think that asking questions about the Bible or Christianity shows that maybe we don't trust God or trust God's word. And maybe sometimes that's how you feel. You think if I ask too many questions, I'm going to stumble across something that doesn't make sense, and then I won't be able to believe it anymore. But this is just simply not the case. We're called to examine and ask these questions, and actually that deepens our understanding and our knowledge of who God is. But we have to understand that we won't necessarily be able to find answers to all the questions. We are only human. One analogy that I have been told in the past was kind of like, it doesn't matter how hard you try, you can't teach an ant to speak English. Not only does it not have the capability of doing that, but its mind is simply not capable of processing that information. Now, I'm not saying that we're all ants, but actually there are some things that we just cannot comprehend, and our minds are only so big, and they can only fill with so much information, that we're going to have areas where we can't find all the answers. We read in the Bible, it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Now, this isn't a cop-out. This isn't saying that, oh, well, the things that we can't explain or can't understand, like, we just have to accept it. But it's just an acknowledgement of the position that we're in. So I do want to touch a little bit on evolution, creation, and the beginning, because this is something that comes up a lot when people talk about science and religion that seems to be at odds. So I just want to start by reading John 1, verse 1. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Now, hopefully you can see from this that it's quite poetic in its nature, and it's very kind of descriptive of how this kind of like beginning, that God was there at the beginning. And our journey of kind of scientific discovery, and I say our journey in kind of the mankind example, at least in the field of physics, is usually where people start this conversation of like, well, how did creation happen? Surely physics has the answers as to like where life began. And maybe this is, you've been told this is kind of, you know, completely opposite to what we're told in Genesis. I mean, many of you will be familiar with the 7 days of creation in Genesis. And how can these things then work together? Well, what we read in 1 John and what we read in Genesis, and actually what we know from physics, actually do work together to formulate an understanding of not only who God is, but how our being came to existence. So Ardloo is a theoretical physicist. He's a professor at Oxford University. And he's also a Christian, and he kind of explains some of this kind of poetic nature of Genesis and how it aims to stand in contrast to the beliefs of the day, where astrology, so kind of like worship of the sun and the moon, was kind of at the forefront of the belief there. So this poetic thing in Genesis about the creation was standing out against astrology. So the age of the universe, or how many days creation took, is maybe not the crux of the problem here. And just because the way that it's written in Genesis kind of just describes how creation came to be and how God's glory is shown through the vastness of the universe. And, you know, you can point to the timing and stuff like this, but Ardloo explains it that actually the time that it took, that we know from science, and the time that it took to form the universe, actually points towards God's glory through the care and devotion that he showed to bringing his creation into being. So there are two particular things that I just want to dive in here, and hopefully some of this is making sense, and if you've switched off at this point, then hopefully you can re-engage. The two things are about design and about complexity. Let me just take one example of a combustion engine, the engine that's in cars, and you probably don't give it much thought. Why should you? You don't need to know how it works. But if you did, if you took time to study it and understand how all the components fit together and how it functions, you'd become very familiar with it. But you probably wouldn't see Henry Ford. Now, Henry Ford's a person who kind of invented the first combustion engine. And just because we understand how it was made doesn't mean that we see the designer. But you see his handiwork, his fingerprints working through the whole thing. So understanding how it works doesn't take away from who made it, but brings us into a greater appreciation of the design. And this is how it is with my work, and why I am so in awe of God through studying what I do in science. When I'm in the lab and I'm kind of investigating that maybe someone's never really looked at before, and understanding how our body works and how the immune system works, I don't go, oh, well, this clearly, now I understand it, God doesn't have a place in that. No, it makes me stop and think, wow, how amazing is this creator, this designer that can make something so complex that it blows me away all the time that I'm doing my work. And just kind of a quick point that actually evolution in the sense of kind of adaptation isn't at odds with Christianity either. There's really good evidence for adaptation, and there's plenty of examples that I can talk about. And actually the creation story about how unique each individual being doesn't exclude the fact that these beings will slowly adapt and evolve over time because of the conditions that we're in. But another example is this complexity that links into evolution. So bear with me, we're going to get into a little bit of physics, but hopefully I'll make it understandable. Now, some of you will be familiar with the laws of physics saying that energy can't be created or destroyed, and we can discuss that at another time of how kind of that links into maybe how the world was created. But actually describes something else called entropy. Now, entropy is kind of this measure of how chaotic or how disordered things are. So when you think of sand on a beach, so if you take a load of sand on a beach and you push it into a mold and you make a nice sand castle, you've created order from the disorder of all the sand everywhere. Now, what happens if you go away and leave that sand castle? Now, providing that no one comes along and kicks it over and the sea doesn't come in and wash it away, what will eventually happen over time is it will crumble and it will dissolve, or not dissolve, but it will kind of go back to its disordered state on the beach. So think back to that thing that I was telling you to do at the beginning about design, and actually how all of these things come together. Now, if we know that this concept of, everything wants to be more disordered, how can something like us come about just by chance? So is this faith then that I have and that you have and that other people have irrational, and science is rational, and somehow we've got to pick between the two? Again, I don't think this is the case, but this is maybe another common discussion point. So let's have a little think about what it means to be irrational. What irrationality is actually living out something different to your beliefs. So by contrast, being rational is living out in accordance with your beliefs. So it's possible to be entirely rational, that is, believe something and live as if that is true, but actually be entirely wrong. There's a philosopher called John Gray who was particularly interested in economics and politics. And he said, if science has told us in the animal kingdom, and we are animals, that it's survival of the fittest, so the strongest win, the weak are cast off, then our society is completely irrational. We live in contrast to that evidence because we look after the vulnerable groups. We look after the elderly and the young and those that are vulnerable. If we were being rational with this evidence, surely we would eliminate those groups if we believe that evidence to be correct. Now, fortunately, we don't live in that society, but does that make us all irrational? Well, we usually use irrational to say what you believe in is wrong rather than that definition that I just explained. And actually, that evidence is probably only a part of the story. But if we go from here, we have to understand what faith is to understand whether faith is indeed irrational. Now, I don't have time to go into loads of detail, and you're probably already getting bored anyway, but the word faith that's used in the Bible, at least most of the time, and when it's referred to in a positive way, is very much closely aligned to trust. If you have faith in something, you put your trust in it. So how do we know we can trust God? Well, if you haven't read the Gospel of Luke from cover to cover, I really, really recommend that you do. This Gospel really shows, at least to me, how science and faith really come together. So much of science, especially in the work I do, relies on taking evidence, assessing the quality and reliability, kind of what we discussed earlier. And informing this, and then taking this kind of then forms what the truth is and what you trust. In the Gospel of Luke, this is exactly what we see. A presentation of evidence, a case for its reliability, and then the decision that you have to make on whether you should trust it. There's evidence of who God is through the life of Jesus. There's a case in why it's reliable. There's historic information in there that can be tested. And then there is a decision that we have to make as to whether we believe it and want to put our trust in it. Now, science can sometimes be a really, really accurate description of things, and I just want to leave you with a couple of examples. Imagine someone has baked a cake, and this cake is put in front of three scientists. One's a biologist, one's a chemist, one's a physicist, and they're asked to kind of explain, what is this cake? Now, they can go through in detail, and the biologist can look at different aspects of kind of maybe the fruit that's in this cake and detail all of that. And the chemists can say, these certain chemicals have been brought together when they've been heated up, this is what it's created. And the physicists can say, well, I understand all the atoms that come together that explain the biology and the chemistry behind it and actually the fundamental of what makes it up. Now, suppose the question was asked, well, why was this cake made? Now, that's an entirely different question, and it doesn't disprove any of the science, as science is still correct. But an explanation of why the cake is there may only be known by the person who baked it. It doesn't mean that that explanation is any less valid than the scientific evidence in front of you, and actually they just form different layers of an explanation. Anyway, I've been talking for quite a bit. I've tried to cover a lot in detail, and hopefully some of those points have made sense. So let's wrap things up and we can continue discussing on Zoom. I hope I've shown you how science and Christianity are not in opposition to each other, but provide different levels of explanation and actually in many cases work together. The tools that we use as scientists to figure out what to trust is exactly the same as pressing into the truth of the Bible and God. We're not called to have blind faith or simply accept things, but ask the right questions and leaning to trust God leads to a deeper understanding and a deeper faith. I want to leave you with just one other example as well, because maybe there is some bits about science that you kind of like, actually, I don't see how I can have, how I can trust in this being called God, because it just doesn't fit with my evidence-based understanding at the moment. Now, the professor that I was talking about, Ard Louis, gives this example of the fact that faith may sometimes be viewed a little bit like marriage. Now, you can ask people who are in that sort of relationship what it's like to be in that relationship. You could read books about maybe the things that you should know about a person before you enter a relationship or a commitment like marriage. But you're never really going to know what it's like until you take that step and actually enter into that relationship. Now, Christianity, knowing about God and faith, sometimes have elements of that too, that we don't really get a full appreciation for who God is until we take that step and go, okay, I'm going to start figuring out like what I'm trusting here. And God, I want you to show up, and I want to see your kingdom. And until we take that step, maybe some of those elements are a bit of a mystery. And indeed, Paul does allude to this kind of mystery of faith. So I want to leave you with that challenge, that if there's something that doesn't quite sit right for you yet, maybe you just need to take that step. And by all means, keep asking those questions. And that's what I want to give the opportunity for now. So please do head over to Zoom. I hope I've answered some of the questions, but I'm sure I haven't answered all of them. And things are probably a little bit confusing. So yeah, head over to Zoom and we'll continue the discussion there.